In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless species have risen and fallen, one truth has remained constant: the apex predators rule through fear, strength, and the spilling of blood. For millions of years, the Zephyrian Empire has dominated entire star systems, their razor-sharp claws and venomous fangs making them the most feared hunters in known space. But what happens when an insignificant human from a backwater planet does the impossible? What happens when someone who has never held a weapon, never raised a fist in anger, somehow makes the galaxy's most terrifying predator bow its head in submission? This is not a story of conquest through superior firepower. This is not a tale of human ingenuity creating bigger, deadlier weapons. This is something far more extraordinary, and far more human. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a simple botanist whose greatest weapon was something the Zephyrians had never encountered before: genuine compassion. The galaxy is about to learn that sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to heal. Marcus Chen had always believed that the most beautiful things in the universe were often the most misunderstood. As he knelt in the hydroponics bay of the research vessel Endeavour, carefully tending to a rare Andromedian flowering vine, he reflected on how this philosophy had shaped his entire life. The delicate purple blooms before him were considered deadly by most galactic travelers, their pollen supposedly toxic to human respiratory systems. Yet Marcus had spent 3 years proving that with proper care and understanding, these very plants could purify ship atmosphere better than any artificial system. The Endeavour was humanity's first deep space botanical research vessel, a modest ship by galactic standards but revolutionary in its purpose. While other species focused on mining operations, territorial expansion, or military advancement, humans had chosen to send scientists into the unknown to study and preserve plant life from across the galaxy. Marcus often wondered if this made them seem weak to other species. Today, he would discover the answer to that question in the most unexpected way. The ship's proximity alarms began their haunting wail just as Marcus finished his morning cultivation routine. Through the transparent aluminum viewing ports, he could see the jagged silhouette of an approaching vessel against the backdrop of distant stars. The design was unmistakable to anyone who had studied galactic politics: angular, predatory lines that seemed to cut through space itself like a blade. Zephyrian. Captain Sarah Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom, tense but controlled. All hands, we have an unscheduled encounter with a Zephyrian patrol craft. Remain calm and continue normal operations. This is likely a routine inspection. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but not from fear. Excitement coursed through him as he realized what this meant. The Zephyrians were legendary throughout the galaxy, apex predators from a harsh world where only the strongest survived. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with elongated limbs ending in retractable claws and a reptilian appearance that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary perfection, they commanded respect and fear wherever they went. Most species went to great lengths to avoid Zephyrian space entirely. But Marcus had read everything available about their homeworld, Zephyros Prime. The planet was described as a wasteland, stripped of most vegetation by industrial expansion and aggressive terraforming projects. What little plant life remained was reportedly stunted and struggling. As a botanist, Marcus found this tragic rather than intimidating. The docking procedure was surprisingly smooth. Zephyrian technology, Marcus noted, was incredibly advanced even by galactic standards. Their ship interfaced with human systems as if they had been designed together. Through the viewing port, he watched as the airlock sealed with mechanical precision that spoke of a highly sophisticated engineering culture. When the inner airlock doors opened, Marcus got his first look at a living Zephyrian. Commander Thax stood in the threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway. His scales were a deep emerald green with darker patterns that Marcus realized must be individual markings, like fingerprints. The Zephyrian's yellow eyes swept the corridor with predatory efficiency, taking in every detail, every potential threat. Captain Rodriguez approached with her standard diplomatic protocols, but Marcus found himself studying the alien's posture, his movements, the way his head tilted when processing information. There was something almost tired about the commander. Not physically tired, but something deeper. An exhaustion that seemed to go beyond the body. The inspection proceeded as expected. Commander Thax moved through the ship with 2 junior officers, examining cargo manifests, checking life support systems, verifying that the endeavor posed no threat to Zephyrian interests. They were professional, efficient, and intimidating without even trying to be. It was when they reached the hydroponics bay that everything changed. Commander Thax stepped into Marcus's domain and stopped dead in his tracks. The Zephyrian's nostrils flared as he breathed in the rich, oxygen-heavy atmosphere of the growing chamber. His yellow eyes widened as he took in the explosion of colors and textures that filled every available surface. Plants from dozens of worlds thrived in carefully controlled microclimates, creating a living tapestry that Marcus had spent months perfecting. This is... Thax's voice was a low rumble, his galactic standard heavily accented but perfectly clear. How is this possible? Marcus stepped forward, forgetting for a moment that he was addressing one of the galaxy's most feared predators. It's all about understanding what each species needs, he explained enthusiastically. Look at these Centauri moss colonies. Everyone thinks they're impossible to cultivate off-world, but they just need specific mineral compositions in their growing medium. And these flowering vines from Andromeda actually help purify the air for other plants. Thax moved closer to examine a particularly impressive display of bioluminescent fungi from the Vega system. My homeworld once had growing things like this, he said quietly. Before the wars. Before the expansion projects. Something in the Zephyrian's tone made Marcus pause. This wasn't the voice of a conquering predator. This was the voice of someone who had lost something precious and irreplaceable. What did they look like? Marcus asked gently. The plants from your world? Thax glanced at his junior officers, who were maintaining their positions but clearly listening intently. For a moment, Marcus thought the commander might refuse to answer. But then, something shifted in those predatory features, and Thax began to speak. There were crystal trees, he said, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. They grew in spiral formations, reaching toward our twin suns. When the morning light hit them, they would sing, a resonant frequency that could be heard across entire continents. And the feeding pools were surrounded by soft, silver grass that would change colors with the seasons. Marcus listened with growing fascination and sadness. The picture Thax painted was of a world that had been magnificent, alive with unique flora that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. What happened to them? Progress, Thax replied bitterly. The Empire needed resources for expansion. The crystal trees interfered with mining operations. The feeding pools were drained to make space for industrial complexes. The silver grass was burned away to clear land for military training grounds. One of the junior officers, a slightly smaller Zephyrian with darker scales, made a soft clicking sound that Marcus somehow understood as distress. Thax noticed and his expression hardened. We are Zephyrians, he said firmly. We adapt. We overcome. We do not dwell on what was. But Marcus could see the pain in all three aliens' eyes. They weren't the remorseless predators that galactic propaganda portrayed. They were people who had sacrificed their world's natural beauty for power and expansion, and some part of them clearly regretted it. Would you like to see something special? Marcus asked impulsively. Thax's head tilted, his yellow eyes focusing intently on the human botanist. What do you mean? Marcus moved to a sealed environmental chamber in the far corner of the hydroponics bay. Inside, carefully protected behind multiple atmospheric barriers, was his most prized specimen, a small crystal formation that pulsed with internal light. This is a crystal tree seedling, Marcus explained. I found genetic samples in an old research database from a Zephyrian scientific expedition from 50 years ago. I've been trying to recreate the proper growing conditions for months. The effect on the three Zephyrians was immediate and dramatic. Thax pressed his clawed hands against the viewing chamber, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The junior officers moved closer, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like morning songs. You grew this? Thax whispered. I'm trying to, Marcus admitted. But I'm missing something. The genetic information is incomplete, and I don't have data on the soil composition, atmospheric requirements, or symbiotic relationships it might have had with other organisms. Thax stared at the tiny crystal formation for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I was hatched beneath the crystal trees, he said. My clutch siblings and I played in their shadows. I remember the songs they made when the wind moved through their branches. Marcus felt his heart racing. Not with fear, but with the excitement of discovery, of possibility. Could you help me? He asked. Could you tell me what they need to grow properly? The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the gentle hum of the ship's environmental systems, could hear the soft breathing of three aliens who were staring at a piece of their lost past. Finally, Thax turned to his officers and spoke in rapid Zephyrian. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotion in their voices, the urgency and hope and desperate longing. When Thax faced Marcus again, something fundamental had changed in his expression. Human, he said formally, I am Commander Thax of the Zephyrian Defense Fleet, 3rd Claw Division. I have served the Empire for 43 standard years and have never requested personal leave. Marcus nodded, sensing the importance of this moment. I am formally requesting permission to remain aboard your vessel to assist with your research, Thax continued. My officers will return to report that your ship poses no threat to Imperial interests. Captain Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. Commander, you're welcome aboard for as long as you need. As the junior officers prepared to depart, they each approached Marcus with something approaching reverence. The darker-scaled one pressed a data pad into his hands. Soil composition records, she said in heavily accented Galactic Standard. From before the burning. The other officer, young enough that his scales still held an almost metallic sheen, bowed formally. If you can bring back the crystal trees, he said, you will have given us more than the Empire ever could. As the Zephyrian patrol craft departed, Marcus found himself alone in the hydroponics bay with Commander Thax. The massive alien was still staring at the crystal seedling, his yellow eyes reflecting its internal light. Why? Thax asked suddenly. Why do you care about plants from worlds you've never seen? Why spend your life trying to preserve things that aren't even from your own species? Marcus considered the question carefully. Because beauty and life are worth preserving, he said finally. Because every extinct species is a loss for the entire galaxy. And because I believe that understanding and caring for other forms of life makes us better than we were before. Thax turned to study Marcus with the same intensity he had shown the crystal seedling. Your species is very strange, he said. Most beings seek to dominate what is different from them. Humans seem to seek to preserve it instead. Maybe that's what makes us strong, Marcus replied. Perhaps, Thax agreed. Or perhaps it makes you vulnerable to those who would exploit such kindness. Has anyone ever tried to exploit your kindness, Commander? The question seemed to surprise Thax. Zephyrians are not kind, he said automatically. We are efficient. We are strong. We are standing in my garden, crying over a seedling from your homeworld, Marcus interrupted gently. If that's not kindness, I don't know what is. For the first time since Marcus had met him, Commander Thax smiled. It was a strange expression on a predatory face, but unmistakably genuine. Perhaps, he said quietly, there is something to be learned from humans after all. As the ship's artificial night cycle began, casting the hydroponics bay in softer lighting, Marcus and Thax began their work. The Zephyrian commander's memories proved invaluable, providing details about growing conditions, seasonal patterns, and ecological relationships that no database could have contained. But, more than that, Marcus began to understand that he wasn't just trying to regrow a plant. He was trying to heal a wound that went to the very heart of what it meant to be Zephyrian. And, in doing so, he was about to discover that the true strength of humanity lay not in superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but in something far more revolutionary, the simple act of caring about someone else's pain. The crystal seedling responded to Thax's guidance with an enthusiasm that amazed even Marcus. Within 3 days of implementing the Zephyrian commander's suggestions about mineral supplements and atmospheric composition, the tiny plant had nearly doubled in size and begun developing the characteristic spiral growth pattern that Thax remembered from his youth. Marcus found himself spending 18-hour days in the hydroponics bay, not out of obsession, but because Thax seemed incapable of leaving. The massive alien would stand for hours watching the seedling grow, occasionally making soft clicking sounds that Marcus had learned were expressions of deep contentment. When Captain Rodriguez suggested that perhaps the commander might like to see other parts of the ship or join the crew for meals, Thax politely declined. "I have spent 43 years without seeing a crystal tree," he explained to Marcus during one of their late-night cultivation sessions. "I will not miss a moment of its growth now." The transformation in Thax was remarkable. The rigid military bearing remained, but underneath it was emerging someone entirely different. When he spoke about his homeworld, describing the complex ecosystem that had once thrived there, his voice took on a warmth that seemed impossible from a creature that the galaxy feared as an apex predator. The crystal trees were not individual organisms, he explained as they worked together to adjust the seedling's nutrient solution. They were connected underground by a network of crystalline roots that spanned continents. When one tree sang in the morning, the song would travel through this network, and, eventually, entire forests would be harmonizing together. Marcus paused in his work, struck by the implications. "A planetary consciousness," he murmured. "The trees were communicating across your entire world." "More than communicating," Thax corrected. "They were sharing resources, sharing information, sharing life itself." When one region faced drought, trees thousands of kilometers away would send water through the root network. When new seedlings needed nutrients to establish themselves, the mature trees would provide everything necessary. As Marcus listened to these descriptions, he began to understand something profound about Zephyrian society. The rigid hierarchy, the emphasis on collective strength, the way they functioned as a unified military force, these weren't cultural choices born from aggression. They were attempts to recreate the connectedness their species had lost when the crystal tree networks were destroyed. "Your people are trying to rebuild what was lost," Marcus said suddenly. "The empire, the military structure, the way you work together, you're trying to become the crystal tree network." Thax's hands stilled over the nutrient controls. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "You see very clearly for a human. Is that why the empire expanded so aggressively? You were looking for something to fill the void?" "Perhaps." Thax's yellow eyes fixed on the growing seedling. "Or perhaps we simply became what we needed to become to survive after our world died. It is difficult to remember which came first, the expansion or the emptiness." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent chime from the ship's communication system. Captain Rodriguez's voice followed immediately. "Marcus, Commander Thax, please report to the bridge. We're receiving a priority transmission from the Zephyrian Defense Fleet." They found the bridge crew assembled around the main display screen, where a familiar face was visible. The darker-scaled Zephyrian officer who had given Marcus the soil composition data was speaking urgently in her native language. Thax listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Sub-Commander Vexus reports that word of my presence on this vessel has reached the Imperial Command," Thax translated. "I am ordered to return immediately for disciplinary review." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. "What does that mean, exactly?" Thax's jaw muscles tightened. "It means that the Empire views my actions as potentially treasonous. Cooperating with alien species on projects not directly beneficial to Imperial expansion is considered a serious violation of military protocol." "And the punishment for treason?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Exile at best," Thax replied. "Execution at worst." The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of ship systems. On the screen, Sub-Commander Vexus was still speaking, her voice becoming increasingly urgent. Thax listened for another moment, then made a sound deep in his throat that was unmistakably a growl. "What else is she saying?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "The disciplinary fleet will arrive here within 2 standard days," Thax translated. "I am to surrender myself immediately upon their arrival. Any resistance will be considered an act of war against the Empire." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They'll take you back to face execution for helping me grow a plant?" "For compromising Imperial security through unauthorized collaboration with inferior species," Thax corrected bitterly. "The specific plant is irrelevant. The fact that I chose to remain with humans instead of continuing my patrol duties is what they consider treasonous." Sub-Commander Vexus spoke again, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Thax's expression softened slightly as he listened. She says that news of the crystal tree is spreading throughout the defense fleet, he translated. Many of the younger officers have never seen images of the old forests. They are calling you the gardener of memory and want to know if you can truly bring back what was lost. Marcus looked around the bridge at the human crew members. Captain Rodriguez was studying her tactical displays with the practiced eye of someone calculating odds. The other officers were checking ship systems and communication arrays. They were preparing for the possibility of conflict, even though they all knew that a single human research vessel would stand no chance against a Zephyrian disciplinary fleet. There has to be another way, Marcus said. Some kind of diplomatic solution. Thax shook his massive head. The Empire does not negotiate with those it considers inferior. And it certainly does not negotiate with traitors. What if we weren't negotiating from a position of weakness? Marcus asked suddenly. Everyone on the bridge turned to look at him. Captain Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking, Marcus? Marcus felt his mind racing as an idea began to take shape. Commander, you said that news of the crystal tree is spreading through the defense fleet. How quickly do you think word would spread if we could prove that the old forests could be restored? Marcus, Thax said slowly, one seedling does not make a forest. No, but it proves the possibility exists. Marcus turned to Captain Rodriguez. Captain, how long would it take to reach the nearest Zephyrian colony world? Rodriguez consulted her navigation computer. About 36 hours at maximum safe speed. But, Marcus, entering Zephyrian space uninvited would be considered an act of aggression. What if we were invited? Marcus looked at Thax. As the ranking Zephyrian officer present, don't you have the authority to grant us safe passage? Thax considered this for a moment. Technically, yes. But, once the disciplinary fleet arrives, that authority will be revoked. Then, we need to move fast. Marcus's excitement was building as the plan solidified in his mind. If we could demonstrate the crystal tree restoration process on an actual Zephyrian world, if we could show your people that their past isn't completely lost. The colonial governors would never allow it, Thax interrupted. They are loyal to the Empire. They would see such a demonstration as a direct challenge to current imperial policy. What about the people? Marcus pressed. Not the governors or the military commanders, but the ordinary Zephyrians living on those worlds. Would they want to see the crystal trees returned? Thax was quiet for a long moment, his yellow eyes distant. There are stories, he said finally. Whispered conversations in the lower ranks. Young Zephyrians who have never seen their homeworld as it was, but who dream of it nonetheless. They trade images of the old forests like contraband, speak of the crystal songs their grandparents remember. Sub-Commander Vexus spoke again from the communication screen, and Thax listened intently. When she finished, he turned to Marcus with something approaching wonder in his expression. Vexus says that 3 junior officers from her ship have requested transfer to other vessels rather than participate in my capture, he translated. And there are reports of similar incidents throughout the fleet. The younger generation is questioning why preserving a piece of our heritage should be considered treason. Captain Rodriguez studied the tactical display again. If we're going to do this, we need to move now. Every hour we delay gives the disciplinary fleet more time to coordinate their response. Marcus nodded, then looked directly at Thax. Commander, this is your choice. We can try to find a diplomatic solution here, or we can take a risk and try to change the entire conversation. But, I need to know, if we go to one of your colony worlds, if we try to demonstrate that the old ways and the new can coexist, will you stand with us? Thax straightened to his full imposing height. For a moment, Marcus saw him as the galaxy saw him, a predator, a weapon shaped by millions of years of evolution and decades of military training. But, then, Thax looked toward the hydroponics bay where a crystal tree seedling was growing in defiance of everything the Empire had decreed was necessary for survival. Human botanist Marcus Chen, he said formally, I am Commander Thax of the Zephyrian Defense Fleet, keeper of memories that my people have tried to forget. I stand with the growing things and with those who tend them. Captain Rodriguez smiled grimly. Then, we're committed. All hands, prepare for emergency departure. Set course for the Zephyrian colony world of Kepler 442b. As the Endeavour engaged its faster-than-light drive and leaped toward uncertain destiny, Marcus found himself back in the hydroponics bay with Thax. The crystal tree seedlings seemed to pulse more brightly in response to their presence, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Are you afraid?" Thax asked quietly. Marcus considered the question honestly. They were flying into Zephyrian space with what amounted to stolen authority, carrying what the Empire would consider seditious cargo, to attempt something that might be viewed as an attack on the fundamental principles of one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. Terrified, he admitted. But also hopeful. Hopeful? Your people spent 43 years turning you into the perfect soldier, Marcus said, watching the crystal seedling's gentle light play across Thax's scaled features. But 20 minutes in a garden turned you back into someone who believes in beauty and growth. That gives me hope that maybe strength and compassion don't have to be opposite things. Thax made the soft clicking sound that indicated deep thought. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps what we thought was strength was actually just fear wearing armor. As they tended the seedling together, preparing it for what might be its first and last chance to sing the ancient songs on a Zephyrian world, Marcus realized that they weren't just attempting to restore an extinct plant species. They were attempting to prove that evolution didn't have to mean abandoning what made life beautiful. They were trying to show that true apex predators were those who protected rather than destroyed. The seedling pulsed with inner light, and, for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he heard the faintest echo of an ancient song carried on the recycled air of a human research vessel hurtling through space toward an uncertain future. In 36 hours, they would discover whether the galaxy was ready to hear that song again, or whether some kinds of beauty were truly lost forever. Kepler 442b hung before them like a jewel against the darkness of space, its surface a patchwork of metallic gray industrial complexes and the deep green of carefully managed agricultural zones. From orbit, Marcus could see the geometric precision with which the Zephyrians had organized their colony world, every structure placed for maximum efficiency, every piece of land allocated for its most productive use. It was impressive in its way, but also somehow sterile. It looks nothing like home, Thax observed quietly as they stood in the ship's observation lounge. His yellow eyes tracked the orbital patterns of cargo vessels and defensive platforms with professional assessment. But, then, neither does home anymore. The communication array crackled to life, and a stern Zephyrian voice filled the air, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences. Thax responded with equal formality, his posture straightening into military bearing as he provided authorization codes and explained their presence. Captain Rodriguez watched the exchange with obvious tension. "What's the verdict?" "Colonial Governor Drexus has granted us permission to land at the primary research facility," Thax translated. "However, he has also made it clear that we have exactly 12 hours before the disciplinary fleet arrives. After that, he will be required to turn me over to Imperial Command." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. 12 hours to convince an entire colonial government that their foundational assumptions about strength and survival were wrong. 12 hours to prove that something the Empire had declared extinct could not only live again but could coexist with modern Zephyrian society. "Then, we better make those hours count," Marcus said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. The descent to the planet's surface revealed the true scope of Zephyrian organization. The research facility where they were directed to land was part of a massive complex dedicated to agricultural optimization and resource extraction. As their shuttle touched down on the designated landing pad, Marcus could see Zephyrian scientists and technicians moving between buildings with the same efficient purpose he had observed in every member of their species. But something was different about these Zephyrians. Where Thax and his patrol officers had moved with military precision, these colonists seemed somehow softer. Not physically, they were still imposing predators by any standard, but their movements lacked the rigid formality of military personnel. These were people who had built lives rather than just following orders. The welcoming committee was headed by Dr. Silix, the facility's chief research coordinator. She was smaller than Thax, with scales that held an almost bronze coloration and eyes that sparkled with intellectual curiosity. When she greeted them at the airlock, her galactic standard was flawless and tinged with genuine enthusiasm. "Commander Thax, human botanist Chen," she said formally. Your transmission about crystal tree restoration has caused quite a stir among our research staff. I must admit, many of us thought such a project was impossible. As they were escorted through the facility, Marcus was struck by how different this environment felt from the military vessel where he had first met Thax. The Zephyrian colonists worked in teams, collaborated openly, and seemed genuinely excited about their research projects. When Dr. Silix introduced them to other scientists, Marcus noticed that many of the younger researchers looked at Thax with something approaching reverence. "Word of your crystal tree has spread through our communications network," one young researcher explained to Marcus. "Many of us have never seen the old forests except in archived images. The possibility that they could grow again." She trailed off, but Marcus could see the longing in her expression. It was the same look he had seen on Thax's face when the commander first encountered the seedling. Dr. Silix led them to the main botanical research laboratory, a vast chamber filled with growing stations, environmental control systems, and specimens from across the galaxy. "We have been working on terraforming projects for new colony worlds," she explained. "But our mandate has always been to create the most efficient agricultural systems possible. Beauty and historical significance are considered secondary concerns." "What if they didn't have to be?" Marcus asked. Dr. Silix paused in her explanation, her head tilting in the characteristic Zephyrian expression of intense focus. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked around the laboratory, noting the sophisticated equipment and the obvious expertise of the research staff. "Your people have incredible agricultural technology. You've created growing systems that can sustain entire colonies. But what if that same technology could restore the ecosystems your ancestors knew?" "The Imperial mandate is clear," Dr. Silix replied carefully. "Colony worlds must maximize productivity and resource extraction. Ornamental flora is considered an inefficient use of resources. But what if ornamental flora could also be productive?" Marcus pressed. "What if the crystal trees could serve a function in your agricultural systems?" Thax, who had been quietly observing the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. "The root networks," he said urgently. "Marcus, the crystal and root networks I described, they weren't just for communication. They were the most efficient resource distribution system our world had ever seen." Marcus felt excitement building as he began to understand. A biological infrastructure that could enhance rather than compete with modern agriculture. Dr. Silix's eyes widened as the implications became clear. "You're suggesting that the crystal trees could actually improve our agricultural efficiency?" "I'm suggesting we find out," Marcus replied. "Do you have a test area where we could attempt a restoration demonstration?" For a moment, Dr. Silix hesitated. Marcus could see her weighing scientific curiosity against imperial protocol. Then, she made a decision that would change everything. "Follow me," she said. The test site was located at the edge of the research complex, a carefully controlled environmental chamber that could simulate different atmospheric and soil conditions. As Dr. Silix activated the various systems, Marcus carefully removed the crystal tree seedling from its transport container. The plant had grown significantly during their journey, now standing nearly 30 centimeters tall and beginning to show the complex crystalline structure that Thax had described. When the seedling was exposed to the chamber's atmosphere, it seemed to pulse with increased brightness. "Remarkable," Dr. Silix breathed. The bioluminescence patterns matched the archived recordings exactly. But, as Marcus began preparing the soil mixture according to Thax's specifications, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Through the chamber's viewing windows, they could see Zephyrian security personnel moving with urgent purpose. "Governor Drexus has ordered immediate termination of this project," announced a voice over the facility's communication system. "All personnel are to evacuate the test chamber immediately." Dr. Silix's bronze scales darkened with what Marcus had learned was a sign of distress. "I'm sorry," she said. "The governor must have received pressure from Imperial Command." But, as they prepared to leave the chamber, something unexpected happened. The crystal seedling, now planted in soil that contained minerals from its original homeworld, began to sing. The sound was barely perceptible at first, a resonant hum that seemed to come from the plant itself. But, as the frequency built, it began to resonate through the chamber's structure, creating harmonics that filled the air with hauntingly beautiful music. The effect on every Zephyrian present was immediate and profound. Dr. Silix stopped moving entirely, her eyes wide and unfocused. Fax made a low sound deep in his throat that Marcus had never heard before. Even the security personnel who had been approaching the chamber stopped in their tracks. By the ancient songs, Dr. Silix whispered. It remembers. The music continued to build, and Marcus realized that the crystalline structure of the seedling was acting as a natural resonator, amplifying and harmonizing the frequencies it produced. But, more than that, the song seemed to trigger something in the Zephyrians themselves, some genetic memory or cultural connection that went deeper than conscious thought. Other researchers began gathering around the chamber, drawn by the sound. Marcus watched in amazement as more than a dozen Zephyrians stood in complete stillness, listening to a song their species hadn't heard for decades. Then, one by one, they began to sing back. It started with Dr. Silix, a low harmonious note that complemented the crystal tree's frequency. Fax joined next, his deeper voice adding a bass foundation to the growing chorus. Soon, every Zephyrian in the vicinity was contributing to a song that seemed to rise from some collective unconscious. The sound was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. It wasn't just music, it was communication, connection, community. It was the sound of a species remembering what they had been before they became what they needed to be. Governor Drexus arrived during the height of the singing, flanked by his administrative staff and clearly intent on shutting down the project. But, when he entered the laboratory and heard the crystal song, he too stopped in his tracks. Marcus watched the governor's expression shift from bureaucratic authority to something much more vulnerable. For a moment, he wasn't a colonial administrator enforcing imperial policy. He was a Zephyrian hearing the voice of his homeworld for the first time in his life. The song gradually faded as the seedling settled into its new environment. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, filled with the weight of memory and possibility. Governor Drexus was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion. How is this possible? Life finds a way, Marcus replied simply. Even when we think it's gone forever. The governor studied the crystal seedling, then looked around at his research staff, many of whom were still visibly affected by what they had heard. The disciplinary fleet will arrive in 8 hours, he said finally. Imperial Command has made their position clear. And, your position, Governor? Dr. Silix asked quietly. Drexus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the singing plant. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone making a decision that would define the rest of his career. Dr. Silix, you will immediately begin preparing a comprehensive research proposal for crystal tree integration into our agricultural systems, he announced. Commander Thax, you will provide all technical specifications and cultural context necessary for the project. Human botanist Chun. He paused, looking directly at Marcus. You will help us prove to the Empire that strength and beauty are not mutually exclusive. As the facility's staff began mobilizing around this new directive, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted. The crystal tree song had done more than just grow, it had awakened something in the Zephyrians that their society had been trying to suppress for generations. But, they still had less than 8 hours before the disciplinary fleet arrived, and Marcus knew that the real test was yet to come. The Empire would not be swayed by sentiment or nostalgia. If they were going to prevent Thax's execution and prove that cooperation could be stronger than conquest, they would need to demonstrate value that even the most pragmatic Imperial commanders couldn't ignore. The crystal tree seedling pulsed with gentle light in its new soil, already beginning to establish the first tentative connections that might someday become a network spanning an entire world. As Marcus watched it grow, he wondered if they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of Zephyrian society, or simply creating a beautiful target for Imperial destruction. The transformation happened faster than anyone had expected. Within 6 hours of the crystal seedling being planted in Kepler 442b soil, it had grown to nearly 2 meters in height and begun developing the complex root system that Thax remembered from his youth. But, more importantly, it had started communicating. Marcus stood in the rapidly expanding test chamber, watching in fascination as Dr. Silix's monitoring equipment detected electromagnetic patterns spreading through the ground beneath their feet. The seedling wasn't just growing, it was actively searching for something. It's looking for the network, Thax explained, his voice filled with wonder as he watched readouts that showed the plant's root system extending far beyond what should have been possible for such a young specimen. The crystal trees were never meant to exist in isolation. They need connection. Dr. Silix looked up from her instruments with excitement. The growth rate is incredible, but that's not the most remarkable part. Look at these soil composition readings. Marcus peered over her shoulder at the data streaming across multiple displays. What am I seeing? The plant is actively altering the mineral content of the surrounding soil, Dr. Silix explained. It's extracting trace elements and redistributing them in patterns that are optimizing growing conditions not just for itself, but for any plant life in the vicinity. To demonstrate her point, she gestured to a series of agricultural test plots that had been established near the crystal tree. Standard colony crops that had been struggling in the facility's carefully controlled but somewhat sterile growing medium were suddenly thriving. Their growth rates had increased by nearly 40%, and their nutritional content was showing marked improvement. It's not just ornamental, Marcus realized. The crystal tree is actually enhancing agricultural productivity. Governor Drexus, who had been monitoring their progress from the facility's command center, arrived with an expression of barely contained excitement. Dr. Silix, your preliminary data suggests that crystal tree integration could increase our agricultural output by 30 to 50% across all crop varieties. Potentially more, Dr. Silix replied. If we could establish a proper root network across the colony, the resource distribution efficiency could revolutionize how we approach terraforming entirely. But their celebration was interrupted by urgent alerts from the facility's sensor array. The disciplinary fleet had arrived ahead of schedule, taking up positions in orbit with the precision of a military force prepared for any form of resistance. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the communication system from the Endeavor. Marcus, we're detecting 7 Zephyrian warships in standard attack formation. They're demanding immediate surrender of Commander Thax and the termination of all research activities. Through the chamber's reinforced windows, Marcus could see Zephyrian security personnel moving to defensive positions around the facility. Governor Drexus was receiving constant updates through his personal communication device, his expression growing increasingly grim with each report. Fleet Admiral Corex himself is leading the disciplinary force, the governor announced. He's one of the most rigid traditionalists in the Imperial Command. If anyone would consider this project a direct challenge to Imperial authority, it would be him. Thax straightened to his full imposing height. Then, I should surrender myself immediately. Perhaps if I cooperate, the Admiral will allow the research to continue. Absolutely not, Marcus said firmly. We're not giving up now, not when we're so close to proving that this can work. Marcus, Thax's voice was gentle but resolute, I will not allow my choices to result in harm to you or your people. The Empire does not make idle threats. Before Marcus could respond, the crystal tree began singing again. But, this time, the song was different, more complex, more urgent. The harmonics resonated through the chamber with an intensity that made the floor vibrate beneath their feet. What's happening? Governor Drexus demanded. Dr. Silix checked her instruments frantically. The root system is expanding exponentially. It's reaching critical mass for network establishment. Through the viewing windows, they could see something extraordinary occurring. The crystal tree's bioluminescent patterns were being reflected in the soil around it, as if light were traveling through underground pathways. And, in the agricultural plots nearby, other plants were beginning to glow with a similar inner radiance. It's sharing the connection, Marcus breathed. The crystal tree is incorporating the other plants into its network. Thax moved closer to the window, his yellow eyes reflecting the spreading patterns of light. This is how it began on our homeworld. One tree would establish itself, then, gradually bring other species into the network. Eventually, the entire planetary ecosystem was connected. The implications were staggering. What they were witnessing wasn't just the restoration of an extinct species, it was the birth of a new kind of ecosystem that could transform how life itself functioned on colony worlds. But their moment of wonder was shattered by the arrival of Fleet Admiral Corex himself. The admiral was an imposing figure even by Zephyrian standards, standing well over 3 meters tall with scales that had darkened to an almost black coloration and scars that spoke of decades of combat experience. When he entered the laboratory flanked by his personal guard, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Commander Thax," his voice was a low rumble that carried absolute authority, "you stand accused of treason against the Zephyrian Empire. Surrender yourself immediately." Thax stepped forward without hesitation. "I am prepared to face imperial justice, Admiral. But I request that you examine the research data before making any decisions about the project itself." Admiral Corex's gaze swept the laboratory, taking in the growing crystal tree, the enhanced agricultural plots, and the complex monitoring equipment that Dr. Silix's team had assembled. "This facility is conducting unauthorized research into extinct biological systems. Such activities are considered a direct challenge to imperial development policies." "With respect, Admiral," Governor Drexus interjected, "the preliminary results suggest that crystal tree integration could increase our agricultural efficiency by more than 40%. From a purely practical standpoint, this research has significant value to the Empire." "Practical value is not the issue," Admiral Corex replied coldly. "The Empire cannot allow subordinate worlds to pursue projects that contradict established imperial doctrine. To do so would be to invite chaos and rebellion throughout our territories." Marcus felt desperation building in his chest. They were so close to proving that the old ways and the new could coexist, but the Admiral seemed determined to see the project as a threat rather than an opportunity. "Admiral," Marcus said, stepping forward despite the obvious danger, "may I ask you a question?" Corex's yellow eyes fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity. "You may speak, human. How long have you served the Empire?" 67 standard years, the Admiral replied without hesitation. "And, in all that time, have you ever seen Zephyrian agricultural systems achieve the efficiency levels we've documented in the past 6 hours?" For just a moment, something flickered in the Admiral's expression. Professional interest, perhaps. "Continue." Marcus gestured toward Dr. Silix's data displays. "The crystal tree isn't competing with modern agriculture, it's enhancing it. The root network is creating a biological infrastructure that could support larger populations on fewer resources. From a military perspective, that means stronger colonies that require less support from the Empire's central systems." Admiral Corex studied the data for several long moments. Marcus could see him processing the implications, calculating the strategic advantages that such technology could provide. But, then, the Admiral's expression hardened again. "Even if your claims are accurate, this project represents unauthorized collaboration with inferior species. The Empire cannot be seen as dependent on alien assistance for its development." "What if it wasn't assistance?" Marcus asked desperately. "What if it was conquest?" The question seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Marcus himself. But, as the words left his mouth, he realized what he was suggesting. "You're not accepting help from humans," Marcus continued. "You're claiming our research, incorporating our techniques into imperial methodology, making them part of Zephyrian science. From the galaxy's perspective, the Empire has once again demonstrated its superiority by taking what it needs from lesser species." Admiral Corex's head tilted in the characteristic Zephyrian expression of intense consideration. Around the laboratory, Marcus could see other Zephyrians processing this reframing of the situation. "You would surrender your research to the Empire?" the Admiral asked. Marcus looked at Thax, at Dr. Silix, at the crystal tree that was still pulsing with inner light as it sang its ancient songs. "If it means the crystal trees can live again, if it means your people can hear those songs on worlds throughout the galaxy, then, yes. The Empire can claim credit for everything we've done here." "Marcus," Captain Rodriguez's voice carried concern and confusion over the communication system, "are you certain about this?" "It doesn't matter who gets the credit," Marcus replied, speaking to everyone present. "What matters is that something beautiful isn't lost forever." Admiral Corex was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Marcus, the research data, and the crystal tree itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested years of difficult decisions. "Dr. Silix, you will prepare a comprehensive report on crystal tree integration for immediate transmission to Imperial Command. This report will reflect Imperial research achievements based on captured alien methodologies. Dr. Silix bowed formally. It will be my honor, Admiral. Commander Thax, your unauthorized collaboration with alien species remains a serious breach of protocol. However, your cultural expertise will be essential for the proper implementation of this technology throughout Imperial territory. Thax's yellow eyes widened in surprise. Admiral? You will be assigned to lead the Crystal Tree Integration Project as a special advisor to Imperial Agricultural Command. Your knowledge of pre-expansion ecosystems makes you uniquely qualified for this role. Marcus felt relief flooding through him, but Admiral Corex wasn't finished. Human botanist Chen, the Admiral's voice carried new respect. The Empire recognizes the value of your contributions to this project. You will be granted the status of honorary Imperial researcher and invited to continue your work within Imperial territories. And my ship? My crew? Marcus asked. Will be escorted to the Imperial Research Station at Zephyros Prime, where you will have access to the most advanced botanical research facilities in the galaxy. As the Admiral made these pronouncements, Marcus could see the other Zephyrians in the laboratory beginning to relax. The crisis had been resolved not through conflict, but through a careful reframing that allowed everyone to maintain their dignity and achieve their goals. But there was something else happening as well. The crystal tree song was continuing to spread through the facility's growing areas, and more plants were beginning to join the network. The bioluminescent patterns were becoming more complex, creating visual harmonies that matched the auditory ones. Admiral, Dr. Silix said suddenly, you should see this. She led them to a viewing platform that overlooked the facility's main agricultural complex. In the growing fields below, thousands of plants were beginning to glow with the same inner light as the crystal tree. The entire agricultural system was transforming before their eyes, becoming something that was both ancient and utterly new. Admiral Corex watched the transformation with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. How extensive could this network become, he asked. Theoretically? Dr. Silix consulted her projections. If properly implemented, a network could span an entire continent. The resource sharing efficiency would be unprecedented. And multiple networks could communicate with each other? According to the historical data Commander Thax provided, yes. Networks could coordinate resource distribution across planetary distances. The Admiral nodded slowly, and Marcus realized that he was seeing not just an agricultural improvement, but a strategic asset that could revolutionize Imperial expansion capabilities. Then, this project has just become a top Imperial priority, Admiral Corex announced. We will begin immediate implementation planning for crystal tree networks throughout Imperial territory. As the Admiral departed to coordinate with his fleet, Marcus found himself alone with Thax in the growing chamber. The crystal tree continued its ancient song, now joined by dozens of other plant species in a harmony that filled the air with living music. You gave up credit for your life's work, Thax observed. Did I? Marcus asked, watching the lights dance through the growing network. Or did I just ensure that it would spread farther than I ever could have imagined? Thax made the soft clicking sound that indicated deep contentment. Perhaps this is what true conquest looks like. Not the destruction of what came before, but the integration of all possibilities into something greater. As they watched the network continue to expand, Marcus realized that they had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The crystal trees would live again, not on one world but, potentially throughout the galaxy. And, in saving them, they had discovered something profound about the nature of strength itself. The greatest predators weren't those who destroyed everything different from themselves. They were those who could recognize beauty and value wherever they found it, and make it part of their own greater purpose. 6 months after the first crystal tree sang on Kepler 442b, the galaxy had begun to change in ways that no one could have predicted. Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Research Station orbiting Zephyros Prime, watching as massive terraforming vessels carried crystal tree seedlings toward distant star systems throughout Zephyrian space. The transformation had been rapid and comprehensive. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a single plant had evolved into the largest ecological restoration project in galactic history. Imperial Agricultural Command had embraced crystal tree integration with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to military campaigns, and the results were nothing short of revolutionary. The Proxima Centauri colonies report agricultural output increases of 67%, Dr. Silix announced as she joined Marcus at the viewing window. Her bronze scales had taken on an almost luminescent quality in recent months, something that Marcus had learned indicated deep contentment in Zephyrians. The Tau Ceti networks have achieved full continental integration, and they're beginning to coordinate resource sharing across oceanic distances. Marcus nodded, still amazed by the scope of what they had unleashed. Any word from the frontier expansion fleets? Admiral Korex reports that crystal tree networks are being established on every new colony world as a standard part of the terraforming process, Dr. Silix replied. The strategic advantages are so significant that Imperial Command has classified the full capabilities of the networks. Through the station's powerful telescopes, Marcus could see Zephyros Prime itself, no longer the barren industrial world that Thax had described. Green spaces were appearing in the gaps between manufacturing complexes, and the first new crystal tree forests in 50 years were beginning to take root in carefully selected locations. How are the original populations responding? Marcus asked. Dr. Silix's expression grew thoughtful. That may be the most interesting development of all. The older generations who remember the original forests are experiencing what our psychologists are calling cultural reintegration. They're remembering songs and stories that have been suppressed for decades. And the younger Zephyrians. She gestured toward a group of technicians working on the station's growing systems. Marcus could see that they moved differently than they had months ago, less rigidly, more fluidly. Their work patterns had become more collaborative, more organic. They're learning to sing, Dr. Silix continued. Not just the crystal tree songs, but new harmonies that incorporate both the old ways and the new technologies. It's as if the networks are teaching them how to be Zephyrian in a way they never learned from Imperial doctrine. The transformation wasn't limited to Zephyrian society. Word of the crystal tree networks had spread throughout the galaxy, carried by traders, diplomats, and curious scientists. Species that had viewed the Zephyrian Empire with fear and suspicion were beginning to see them differently. Captain Rodriguez approached from the station's command center, carrying a data pad with the latest communication summaries. Marcus, you're going to want to see this. We're receiving requests for botanical collaboration from 17 different species. The Andromedans want to discuss integration of their flowering vines with crystal tree networks. The Centaurians are asking if their moss colonies could benefit from network connection. Even the usually isolationist vegans are inquiring about joint research projects. Marcus felt a smile spreading across his face. This was what he had always dreamed of, a galaxy where different forms of life could strengthen each other rather than compete for dominance. There's more, Captain Rodriguez continued. The Galactic Cooperative Council has formally invited the Zephyrian Empire to participate in the new interspecies botanical preservation initiative. They want to establish crystal tree networks as the foundation for galaxy-wide ecological restoration efforts. The implications were staggering. The Zephyrian Empire, which had spent centuries expanding through military conquest, was being invited to lead a coalition dedicated to preservation and cooperation. What's Admiral Korex's response? Marcus asked. He's ordered a full tactical assessment of the proposal, Captain Rodriguez replied with obvious amusement. But he's treating it as a strategic opportunity rather than a threat. I think he's beginning to understand that this kind of influence might be more powerful than anything they could achieve through traditional military means. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thax, who had been spending most of his time on Zephyros Prime coordinating the homeworld restoration efforts. The massive Zephyrian moved with a grace that Marcus had never seen in him before, as if he had finally found his natural rhythm. Marcus, Dr. Silix, he greeted them warmly. I bring news from the surface. The Eternal Grove project has achieved its first major milestone. Marcus looked up with interest. The Eternal Grove was the most ambitious part of the restoration effort, an attempt to recreate the original crystal forest networks that had once spanned continents on Zephyros Prime. The northern network has achieved full integration with the surviving root systems from the original forests, Thax continued, his voice filled with wonder. For the first time in 50 years, the ancient songs are being heard on our homeworld. How extensive is the network? Dr. Silix asked. currently about 1,200 square kilometers, but expanding rapidly. The truly remarkable thing is how the new growth is incorporating the industrial infrastructure rather than replacing it. The crystal trees are growing around manufacturing complexes, integrating them into the network's resource distribution system. Marcus found this development particularly fascinating. Instead of viewing technology and nature as opposing forces, the crystal tree networks were demonstrating that they could be complementary. Factories were becoming more efficient as the networks provided optimized resource flows. Manufacturing processes were being enhanced by the biological sensors that the trees provided. The entire concept of industrial development was being reimagined. "There's something else," Bax said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "The old records indicate that crystal tree networks don't just share resources and information. They also preserve memories." "What kind of memories?" Marcus asked. "Cultural memories, historical records, even individual experiences that have particular significance to the community. The networks serve as a kind of living library, preserving the knowledge and wisdom of everyone who has been connected to them." Dr. Silix's eyes widened as she understood the implications. The networks we're establishing throughout the galaxy could become repositories for the collective knowledge of every species that participates. We could be creating a galactic memory that would preserve the cultural heritage of entire civilizations. As if summoned by their conversation, Admiral Corex appeared on the observation deck. The massive military leader had changed as well over the past months. While he still carried himself with absolute authority, there was something warmer in his demeanor, something more connected to those around him. "Human botanist Marcus Chen," the Admiral said formally, "Imperial Command has reached a decision regarding the Interspecies Botanical Preservation Initiative." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. The Admiral's tone was difficult to read, and the future of galactic cooperation might depend on the Empire's response to this opportunity. "The Empire will not merely participate in this initiative," Admiral Corex announced. "We will lead it. The crystal tree networks represent a strategic advantage that could reshape interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. But, more than that." The Admiral paused, looking out at the terraforming vessels carrying life to distant worlds. "They represent something that the Empire has not had for many generations. They represent hope for a future that is greater than our past." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes. "Admiral, I don't know what to say." "Say that you will continue this work," Admiral Corex replied. "The Empire is establishing the Galactic Restoration Academy on Zephyros Prime. You will serve as its Director of Botanical Sciences, working with researchers from every species in the known galaxy." The magnitude of the offer was overwhelming. Marcus would have access to resources beyond anything he had ever imagined, the opportunity to work with lifeforms from across the galaxy, and the chance to see his vision of interspecies cooperation become reality on a galactic scale. "What about my ship? My crew?" Marcus asked. "The Endeavor will become the Academy's flagship research vessel," Captain Rodriguez replied. "Though we'll probably need to upgrade it significantly to handle some of the projects we're planning." As they discussed the details of this new endeavor, the crystal tree in the station's central growing chamber began its evening song. The melody carried through the station's atmospheric systems, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very structure of the facility. But, this time, the song was different. Instead of the solitary voice they had first heard months ago, this was a chorus that included voices from dozens of worlds throughout Zephyrian space. The networks were connecting across interstellar distances, creating a symphony that spanned light years. Other species throughout the station began to respond to the music. Humans hummed along with melodies that somehow felt familiar despite being utterly alien. Andromedans contributed their own harmonic frequencies. Even the mechanical drones seemed to adjust their operational rhythms to match the cosmic song. "Listen," Thax said softly. "Do you hear it?" Marcus listened more carefully, and gradually became aware of something extraordinary. Beneath the obvious melodies, there were other voices joining the song. The networks weren't just connecting crystal trees anymore, they were somehow incorporating the communication frequencies of every species that had participated in their development. "It's learning from all of us," Marcus realized. The network is becoming something entirely new, something that includes not just Zephyrian heritage but the cultural contributions of every species we've worked with. Dr. Silix checked her instruments and confirmed what they were all beginning to understand. The networks are no longer purely Zephyrian technology. They've evolved into something unprecedented, a truly interspecies biological communication system. Admiral Corex nodded slowly. Then, perhaps it is time for the Empire to evolve as well. If the networks can unite different species while preserving their individual characteristics, perhaps we can learn to do the same. As the galactic song continued to build, incorporating voices from across known space, Marcus realized that they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They hadn't just saved an extinct species or restored a lost ecosystem. They had created the foundation for an entirely new kind of civilization, one based on connection rather than conquest, on preservation rather than domination. The crystal trees sang their ancient songs to the stars, but now those songs carried new harmonies, new voices, new possibilities. And, in listening to them, the galaxy was beginning to remember that the greatest strength came not from the ability to destroy what was different, but from the wisdom to nurture what was beautiful. Marcus stood on the observation deck of a Zephyrian research station, watching ships carry life and hope to distant worlds, and knew that this was only the beginning. The networks would continue to grow, continue to connect, continue to teach every species in the galaxy that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. In the growing chambers throughout the station, crystal trees pulsed with inner light, their songs carrying across the cosmos the message that Marcus had always believed, that the most beautiful things in the universe were often the most misunderstood, and that true apex predators were those who chose to protect rather than destroy. The galaxy was learning to sing again, and the music would echo among the stars forever.